everyone. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us on this Monday in December. I am super, super excited to be able to introduce a really good friend, a colleague, and just an all-around rock star at Northwestern and beyond, Dr. Burnett-Zeigler. She's a licensed clinical psychologist and associate professor of in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences here at Feinberg School of Medicine. She has 2 decades of clinical experience helping people with stress, trauma, mood, and anxiety conditions and difficulty in interpersonal relationships. In her clinical practice, she promotes holistic wellness through mindfulness, self-compassion, and healthy behavior change. And her amazing portfolio of research and scholarly work focuses on the role of social determinants of health. And the role that they play in mental illness and treatment, particularly in the Black community. And this book, the only thing wrong with this book, my copy, is that it's not signed. It gives me great pleasure to invite and welcome Dr. Burnett-Zeigler. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Dr. Simon. This is such an honor to be in this conversation with you. I remember when I was trying to figure out how to write a grant, and I was chasing behind you as someone whose career I wanted to model myself after. And so I feel so fortunate that, I've been able to become close colleagues with you, but also friends. So thank you for inviting me to this conversation today.
Well, listen, you well surpassed me. There's no way. I have not written a book. I don't have the bandwidth. That's amazing. So you're going to have to teach me and show me. So now I can chase back after you. You've been on a billion book tours and talking about this book nonstop. And it is just incredible. Everybody I talk to is like, didn't know about the book and is about to buy it, and then or has the book and is like, yes, I read it cover to cover in less than a day. And it speaks to me in so many ways, and it speaks to so many people, not just Black women, but it speaks to so many people. So thank you so much for writing it. I really just want to start out with what inspired you to do this.
Yeah, so I, like many people, always had this kind of seedling of an idea about writing a book. I turned over what that might be. I thought it might be memoir. I thought it would be mental health. I thought it would be, a variety of different things. And then in 2018, I wrote an article for the New York Times called "The Strong and Stressed Black Woman." And someone reached out to me who would later become my book agent and said, I think this could be a book. And so I was like, okay, this is my opportunity to take this, gnawing voice in the back of my head that had considered writing a book and really act on it. And this book really is grown out of that article. In that article, I talk about my grandmother as a strong Black woman. I talk about, everything that she accomplished. And I talk about the other side of the strong Black woman, the physical health problems, the trauma that she endured, and the way that she coped with that through strength and by not showing that experience to the outside world, which is what I do through many other examples in the book as well.
Yeah, I see that a lot in my community, in our communities, in terms of being a strong woman of color. Yes. Can you talk a little bit more about the strong Black woman?
Yeah, I think the strong Black woman, or strong woman, because I think you're absolutely right that women in general have been put in positions where we have to be strong just to make it. And what that looks like is a survival mechanism. It's to be strong to take care of your family, to be strong to be able to make it in the workplace, to be strong to be able to manage all of the multiple responsibilities that you have, but also in the midst of tribulation. So despite your trauma, despite whatever's going on at home, despite racism, discrimination, unfair treatment in the workplace, that strength is supposed to continue to endure. And that's what we show people. That's it. That's what culturally, what so many Black women and women in general have been um, taught to show people. You always go out with your game face on. You present yourself as having it together, as not having any fear, not having any weakness, but being able to manage it. And I certainly, relate to that on a personal level. Despite all the fear, the worry, the doubt about whether or not I can do it, certainly not leading with that openly, particularly at work. But then there's the other side. There's the side that is anxious and worried and depressed, and the side that's coping through, unhealthy eating, the side that is, having difficulty in their relationships, perhaps domestic violence in relationships, or traumatic births and pregnancy trauma and those types of things. Another way that stress and trauma shows up. And I wanted this book to kind of honor both sides, to honor the resilience and the survival, all the things that women and Black women are proud of. When you say, yes, we push through, we make it, we get it done, but also give, a lot of space and honor to the things that are less often talked about.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And this idea of strong Black women, where does it exactly come from?
Yeah, I think that it's a term that's kind of been put around for decades now, originating out. People believe that this prototype originated out of slavery, whereby Black women's strength again was necessary for literal survival, through life or death survival, and the essential elements of that strength being passed down through example of our grandmas. There's not just my grandma in the book, but a lot of other grandmas that show up through what we see as media examples of Black women that we look up to, like, the Michelle Obamas and the Oprahs, you mentioned earlier. Oprah in particular is an example I really like, because she talks openly about her history of trauma. And these are people that we kind of elevate and look to as role models. And in doing that, continue to kind of follow this example of strength, of how we're supposed to show up in the world. I'm kind of diverging a little bit, but I love that. Okay. I love now that there's so many revered Black women that would probably be called strong Black women that are also talking about their suffering. And I think that's new. The Naomi Osaka, even going back to Michelle Obama talking about depression, and Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles and others, Gabrielle Union, others that are these kind of ideal, if you will, models of success and beauty. But they're also entering into the conversations some of their struggle. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, those pretty important. Absolutely. How do we, in the workplace and just us normal, ordinary folks, so to speak, how do we, how do we learn how to voice and do a better job of not just keeping everything internalized, being the strong woman? How do we, come to terms with that, especially when you're in an environment like this one that is so, there's expectations and norms set for us in our workplace, for sure, and in our careers.
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question.
Your next book.
And well, if I'm being honest, it's a struggle that I wrestled with even in writing the book. Like I said, I also have been influenced by these cultural norms of what you talk about and what you don't talk about.
Mhm.
And in the book, it is personal, it is vulnerable, and there was a lot of, fear about what that would mean, particularly in the workplace. Um, and the way that I talk to myself through it is simply to remind myself that everybody has a story. And I think that the more and more that you have opportunity to talk with people kind of in intimate spaces. I mean, I get it as a therapist, but even as a friend or just listening, you realize everybody has a story,
Mhm.
whether they're talking about it or not. And the
Mhm.
more that we're able to share those stories, create safe spaces for those stories to be shared, um, and cultivate that compassion, I think it frees up the space for more people to be able to be vulnerable, but also their authentic selves. I say this in a lot of my book conversations, but it kind of resonated with me so much. One of Brene, I'm paraphrasing a Brene Brown quote, but she says, "We like to see vulnerability in other people, but we don't like to do it for ourselves."
Yeah.
And when I heard that, I thought that was so profound because I certainly have felt that way. I see people kind of telling these stories, and I'm so drawn to them, and
Mhm.
kind of encouraged by their bravery and sharing their stories. But then when it was my turn, I'm like, you know, more fear and reluctance.
Yeah.
Um, and so, pivoting and thinking about what you get out of hearing someone else's story and what
Mhm.
they might get out of hearing your story, I think is how we can kind of move the needle on that.
Yeah, I think sharing is our stories and showing some vulnerability is really important at every stage of our life, at every level of leadership, whatever position we have. And just being a mother is really important to
Yeah.
remember that I have to show that I'm vulnerable in front of my children because I don't always succeed and win. There's about, you
Yeah.
fail a lot. So I think that's really profound and really important take home message. So how was the book received by your colleagues?
Yeah. None of my fears came to be, thank goodness.
That's good.
Um, I know. That might have been like top two fears, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, can
I
imagine.
had gotten lots of, permissions, if you will, from my family. So there was less concern around that. Um, but yeah, the work was probably top two fears. I've gotten nothing but a lot of support, a lot of, positive words. And that means a lot. You and I know this can be a scary space.
Mhm.
Um, and a scary space in general, a scary space for women of color specifically. Um, but overwhelmingly kind, positive, supportive feedback. And so I feel I'm extremely grateful for that.
That's great. Did anything surprise you? Anyone's reaction?
I think that surprised me. Like I think for a variety of reasons. One being I don't know that there are a lot of examples of women just kind of putting it all out there at work, for one. Also, I think that, as a psychologist, we are trained on, what you share, what you don't share, and how to manage that. And just quickly, as an aside, when I was like almost done with the book, I became aware that Marsha Linehan, who's a well-known psychologist, DBT, for those of you who might be familiar with that, I was familiar with her work, familiar with her psychological interventions and the like, but was not familiar with her personal disclosure around her mental health challenges and other life challenges. And I stumbled across this essay in which she talked about giving a speech, and someone in the room standing up and saying, like, are you one of us? And that was kind of her moment when she disclosed her own kind of personal life experiences kind of for the first time. And so I took that piece of information as a sign. I mean, she's an academic, she's a therapist, she's a well-respected, you know, scholar. And I'm like, okay, this is an example that I can turn to. So yeah, that was, I think you were asking me what surprised me. And I think the lack of pushback probably surprised me.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. So on the book tour, has anything surprised you outside of academia and here? Any memorable moments?
Let's see. I wouldn't say it was a surprise per se, but something that well, I guess that's the definition of surprise, unexpected.
Yeah.
Although, so the target audience is Black women with the goal of having broad implications for a variety of different communities, women, people of color, mental health providers, other social service providers, and just people in general. And I think one welcome surprise is how it's been received for kind of the broader community, in addition to Black women, white men, Black men, mental health providers, and the like. I always really enjoy hearing the nuggets that people take out of it, that they felt had, you know, particular significance for them. So I like talking about it in various like specialty audiences to hear kind of what pieces people will take out. I'm on the board of Threshold's mental health organization, and they did a book club for me. And a lot of people came. It was probably maybe 50% white men. And they had clearly all read it and, you know, had really, I appreciated kind of hearing the questions that they asked and the takeaways that they had. So yeah, that was a nice surprise.
Awesome. So I have a lot of questions, but I also want to be mindful that I insert some of the questions from the audience as we move along. So I'm going to look at the chat for a moment and help interject some of those questions. How does someone balance being humble versus showing off how great we are? You know, telling our stories, there's a lot of humility, but then some of our peers do such a great job of showing off how great they are. So how do you balance that?
Yeah, you know, I think that's a great question. And I'll answer it by sharing a recent experience I had. I was recently at a dinner where the former CEO of Lego was speaking. And this is a guy that is well accomplished, had a lengthy career as an executive, kind of rebranded and rebuilt the organization. And one of the biggest takeaway I got from his talk was, in all of his stories, he talked about his challenge, how he went off course when he had full-fledged mess ups, how he made the wrong decision. And I think that when I listen to people that I admire and respect, not only for their accomplishment, when they talk about those pitfalls and challenges, that helps me to know that the journey is kind of bumpy, and that, you know, it's a part of the process. And I try and do that particularly when talking with students as well. And so, yeah, I would say just tell it all, like the good and the bad, the successes and the challenges, because I think for people that just focus on the successes, they're probably only just telling part of the story.
Yeah, kind of like how Instagram and Snapchat and
Exactly.
TikTok show the finer side of life.
Exactly. The
That
filtered side.
this much of life, but not
The
the rest of
filter.
the picture.
Yes.
Uh, yeah, no, absolutely. And then I think balancing that with self-care, I think is really important. Like being vulnerable actually takes a lot of energy out of you.
It does.
Yeah. So how do we you know well, first, how do you define self-care? And what's the like what are some of the ways that we can better insert that into our life? Why is it just, why is it so important?
Yeah, I think I get asked that question a lot. And the answer that I've kind of um, settled on is, to me, one of the number one aspects of self care is really good boundaries. Because I think boundaries is just a core aspect of the other ways that we can take care of ourselves, being mindful of, what we take on, how much we're doing, how we engage with other people, what you want to share with other people versus what you don't want to share with other people, how many assignments or tasks you take on, having space for rest, having space for joy and other things that you want to do. I think at the core of all of it is being able to have clear boundaries to be able to do those other kind of specific activities that might be, self-care for you, whatever that might be. um there are other things that I do. I'm a yogi, and I like lots of things that feel good, but on a day-to-day basis, I try to intentionally examine what am I saying yes to, and doing that in a really over and over again in a really deliberate way.
Yeah, really good advice for sure. How do you think, though, the pandemic has changed the way that Black women in particular approach and think about mental health and self-care? Do you think it's changed?
I do think it's changed. I do think it's changed. And I think it's actually a really interesting conversation. Um, I've seen some think pieces that have talked about how being out of the office has really made Black women, and particularly, more aware of the toxicity of the office space. Um, the microaggressions, the um, that uncomfortable feeling of not feeling like you don't fit in or feeling like you don't belong. Um, Other norms that are put onto people, like, there's a lot of conversation about hair and, what you do, how you dress and how you look, and how that's even shifted when people are at home and they present in a different way than they may have presented if they were coming into the office. And so I think it's really created a space for people to, one, notice that and say, yeah, I'm still busy, but I just feel safer and more comfortable and more free to kind of look how I look, and, you know, whatever it may be at home.
Mhm.
And I don't want to go back to that. And thinking about what steps, if possible, can be taken to not kind of re-enter toxic spaces as we navigate whatever this new norm might be. Yeah.
It's so interesting that comment that, our homes and places where we Zoom from now are our safe space. And so you're taking that safe space and then being able to then Zoom into work, which is a relatively unsafe space, or not a good space at all. Toxic is the word you used. It's just a fascinating concept. I wonder if we know if that's helped people cope better. and or not? Do we know?
Yeah, I think I agree that it's fascinating. I think that there are, of course, people that kind of fall across the spectrum on that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for a lot of Black women and people of color that are in spaces where they are the minority, a small minority, and I talk about this in the book again, like the microaggressions, the you know, it's the little things: clothes, hair, food, commonalities, what TV you talk about, what radio you talk about, being left out of conversations, being not invited to things that are kind of in your face in a blatant way when you're in the office, that you can be removed from if you're at home. But on the other hand, and I've seen this in therapy as well, I've seen people be anxious about their coworkers being in their home on Zoom. And what comes with that, there's, I'm sure everyone on the call knows there's all these conversations about people's backgrounds and what their background space looks like. And do you have the right books? And do you have the plant set up? And do you have, that's another way of being judged. That could potentially be harmful as well.
Yep. There's always something, right?
Yeah.
Always something. There is a question in the chat about the code switching. Like, what are your thoughts on the mental health effect on Black women due to bringing survival mechanisms like code switching into the home as a result of working from home? You think the code switching happened more or less?
Can you repeat the question? I think I got the gist of the question, but can you please repeat it just so I can make sure I'm clear?
What are your thoughts on the mental health effect on Black women due to bringing survival mechanisms such as code switching into the home as a result of work from home practices?
Bringing code switching into the home. I will say this. I know that there's a literature that talks about the mental labor involved in code switching, period, whether it's in the workplace. I think it was focused on in the workplace. And it actually was using this tool called the DISC. If you're familiar with that, it's kind of like an employee leadership assessment scale. And it looks at the difference between your true self and your work self. And the further apart those lines are, the more like tension and strain there is, distress, if you will. I understand that as a psychologist, as the labor that's involved in kind of having to constantly shift, set shift between what you're presenting. So I think that if it's code switching in the workplace or at home, that there's some labor and potential distress that can be associated with that.
How about this one? How has, as a Black woman, what were your biggest challenges having people accept your thoughts and views?
Oh, I love that. My biggest challenge was having the courage to say them in the first place. Yeah, I love that question. I've never been asked that before. I was one of those people that always had like so much to say, and it just like rumbled in my mind, and I just sat in the corner of the room like having long conversations with myself about, that I wasn't saying out loud. I wasn't saying it in the meeting. I wasn't saying it in, whatever setting it was. I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, I would just go on and have like really firm, clear opinions about whatever it was. And so my challenge was just being able to say the thing. Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, is there something that you didn't say in the book that you wanted to, but for a particular reason?
No, I mean, getting to the point of writing the book was definitely like a journey. I think how I'm understanding that question, there was a long process involved in that. Like I did Public Voices, and Public Voices was kind of my first practice at saying my thoughts out loud for a public forum. And I think those skills kind of translate, because that's vulnerable too. You put words on a page that you can't take back, and people can disagree and they can criticize and they can go crazy in the comments. And I think that's, for me, that was like a muscle to build, to be comfortable doing it and be comfortable tolerating whatever might come next. So with the book, I tried not to hold back. There wasn't anything I said. But I also tried to be really fair and balanced and honest. And I, over and over and over again, looked at the words to make sure it felt like honest and true to what I was trying to convey.
Yeah, no, I definitely felt that you were being honest and true. That was really, really much appreciated as I went through the book. Another person in our chat is asking if you feel that a religion played a huge role in the idea of the strong Black woman. And can you please share your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. When you look up like writings or just, again, other think pieces about strong Black women, having being strong in her faith is always typically one of those core characteristics. And also a rationale for why one should not be overly emotional or be vulnerable, because if you are strong in your faith, you know that God will get you through. And so that's what you hold on to, rather than being consumed by negative emotion. So I definitely think religion, spiritual foundation, and just the role of that in the Black community in general is a core part of the development of the strong Black woman. And there's a chapter on that, by the way, for the person that asked that question. There's a chapter on the role of religion and the strong Black woman.
And I see that having faith and religion is part of that healing. That's really essential. And in the healing chapters of the book, you talk about that first step in healing as identifying your suffering and how this pain shows up in your life. What do you feel is the most important, key to begin that process? Because some of us are, obviously, we're all on a different trajectory and different part in this process, especially with the pandemic for a variety of reasons. So what do you think is, how can we, what are the key things that we need to think about as we begin this process of healing?
Yeah, thanks for that, because that is one of my biggest goals for the book, is that it sparks awareness around suffering. I think for Black women, for so many people, we cope with our suffering by being busy and filling in the space. And that's a distraction from the pain, because so many people feel like, if I experience this pain, then I'm not going to be able to function. Like, I got stuff to do. I can't be thinking about, this trauma. I can't be thinking about my messed up relationship or my fractured relationship with my parents, or whatever the case may be. Like, I have things to do, so I'm not going to think about it. Mm-hmm. But as a clinician, the trauma literature talks about the importance of approaching trauma, approaching that which is feared. And then, my background and interest in mindfulness talks about the importance of just awareness of what's showing up. And so it's one of my hopes that the book prompts people to just slow down and pay attention to what's showing up. And that requires slowing down. That requires creating space.
Mm-hmm.
And so many times people don't think about the many ways they're distracting themselves. Like, for example, my mom, I talk about her so much now, so she's over it. But my mom is like one of those people that has a lot of noise happening in her house all the time.
Mm-hmm.
The TV's on, the radio's on, like, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, but that's a distraction.
Mm-hmm.
What purpose does this noise serve? And she'll acknowledge, like, I can't stand the quiet. And there's so many people like that just can't. The quiet is uncomfortable. The same with like how busy we are. People are busy and like feeling the dread of their busyness. But if they don't have anything to do, then what shows up in that space is intolerable.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think just like creating the space to see what shows up and becoming aware of that is really the first step toward taking some step, whatever that step might be. It might be going to a therapist. It might be, who knows? It could be a laundry list of steps, but being able to say, this, I am sad. I am still hurt by, this lost relationship or this lost opportunity. And then being able to kind of unpack that, I think, is the first step.
Yeah, when people dive into work and just to do a ton of things, work, and that is a distraction as well. And I wonder, I wonder if, the great resignation that's happening, or the great, people stopping working, quitting work and going to another job or not at all. I wonder if that has anything to do with starting to be more introspective with what somebody is suffering right now, and that experience, and like that first step of healing almost.
Yeah, I think that I heard a really great episode on NPR about this great resignation this weekend. And I think that at least in that episode, one of the things that I took away with was the drastic shift in our day-to-day prompted people to kind of look at those around them and their environment in a drastically different way. Like, who is really, what spaces really don't feel good to me? Who really supports me? If I could give a quick example, because it really kind of stayed with me for a couple of days. Well, this was, like I said, on the NPR episode over the weekend, and they were talking about people that had quit their jobs during the pandemic. And they had a guy on there that worked at McDonald's. He had worked at McDonald's for many years, and he liked his job. And over the course of the pandemic, I guess McDonald's was giving out, he's making minimum wage, doing what he needs to do to take care of himself. Over the course of the pandemic, I guess McDonald's was giving out free meals to essential workers. And this rubbed him really badly, because he said, I'm an essential worker. I'm here in a pandemic feeding these people, and no one has given me anything. This company hasn't given me anything. They haven't shown up. The managers don't show up. The executives don't show up. And it was like that awakening around, I think that just has brought implications for a lot of different spaces, that there was this outpouring of like showing up, but how do you show up like for your own, if you will, and offer them that support and care to the people that are closest to you. So, yeah.
It was really interesting from a healthcare provider perspective. We went from, the beginning of this pandemic, everyone was like cheering on healthcare professionals and essential workers and frontline workers in many different ways. And then all of a sudden something happened in the fall of last year or so, after the first few months, and people started forgetting about us. And then the vaccine this came out in, end of December and January, moving forward of this year, and that, reluctance, refusal, whatever it is, to not get the vaccine it feels to many of us a slap in the face, or not to wear a mask.
Right.
And then just people forgetting about essential workers and not caring is really quite stark. This has been quite an interesting journey. But you can imagine, I can imagine the underpinnings of some of this resignation, and why we're seeing, a loss of important personnel in the healthcare team, especially nurses. That's a big example right now. And even at Northwestern, right? So it's fascinating, it really is.
Yeah.
There are a few questions around allyship, and if you could possibly address a little bit around how white women and non-Black people in general can be allies for women of color when it comes to mental health.
Yeah, I get this question a lot. And I think kind of my number one answer is thinking about how you can create space for others, for people of color, thinking about the space that you occupy, and thinking about how you can create space for those that might not typically be invited to the space. And then, of course, decentering the self. I think so often in these allyship conversations, which of course are becoming more and more prevalent now, there's kind of unrecognized urge to center the self, the person of privilege, and really working against that. And holding space, whether if it's mental health, holding space for their experience, being able to widen the perspective that you have to a broader perspective, and thinking about, again, various ways to first examine the space that you occupy. That might be taking a critical look at your privilege. That might be, noticing how much you talk in a meeting. That's taking away from someone else talking in a meeting. It could be, the biggest to the smallest thing. And then just making room.
And piggybacking on that, another question from the audience is, do you have advice on how allies can provide feedback to people in power or people in leadership positions to make recommendations or better support our Black women colleagues?
Oh, that's a pack.
Tell our leadership.
That's a pack question.
Yes.
I'm gonna go adjacent to that question.
Okay. Fair enough.
And I think, in those spaces, if there's opportunity to be a sponsor for someone, and by sponsor, I mean saying that person's name, lifting their name as someone that should be considered for a potential opportunity when they may otherwise be overlooked. That's not feedback per se. I hear the question is about feedback, but I just think that's such a big question. But the idea of lifting names of people of color to leadership is an additional critical way that people can be allies.
Thank you. And here's another question that kind of is similar, but do you feel that it's the responsibility of non-Black supervisors and managers who work with Black women and women of color to better understand this, or is this a personal journey? Is this yet another thing we have to work through in the workspace, since work is supposed to be work?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. Yes, I do think it's a responsibility. I think that to have a broad understanding of people and the perspectives and life experiences of the people that you're working with as a team leader is a fundamental aspect of good leadership. Otherwise, you're not seeing the people with whom you're interacting with fully. You're only seeing their work and not giving full space and credence to all of the other things that they're bringing with them. I love that question though, because I think that that's the urge for so many people, just focus on the work. But I feel pretty strongly that that's just not realistic. I mean, we're human beings that are impacted by all this stuff that's happening in society. We're impacted by the stuff that's happening at home. That's a differential experience for people of color, often, that, you know, are more likely to have trauma, more likely to have, you know, perhaps a greater burden of family responsibilities. And to discount that is to not fully see your team. So I do think it's a responsibility.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, being a servant leader, you have to embrace your team, know who's on it, and be able to create that space, as you say. It's so critical. And the higher the level of leadership position, I think the more responsibility you have to do that. And I think that's where a lot of our leaders miss the point, or mess up. And that's what then creates this down spiral of how you feel and how you react in the workplace, and that feeling that you're not valued, and that you're not visible, and that you're
right.
And so that's
not visible. That's it for sure.
I am do you have a story behind the artwork? I know who did it, but like Sunji
Malenga, yeah.
Did you ask the specific picture? Or?
So I will share that there was another cover. There was another cover initially that I love art in general. I love Black art specifically. And when I surveyed the initial cover, it got very polarizing responses. It was a woman, it was an image of a Black woman's body that was exaggerated. And so people either loved it for the artistic expression or hated it as a potential like mockery or offense of Black women's bodies. So I know. So I was like,
even though you're a Black woman and you
exactly. And the artist that did that cover was also a Black woman, by the way. So that cover was put to the side, and my publisher suggested this cover, and I read about her and kind of the I guess her artistic orientation, and really felt that it was closely aligned with what I was trying to do with the book. And she talks about, you know, the space. All her images look like this. If anyone takes the time to look at any of her other work, it's always like a Black female image against a white space, and thinking about how we occupy space. And I felt really closely attached to that. So I loved it.
It is quite lovely. Love it. But I'm sure the other choice was also quite beautiful.
It was the polar opposite. It was like colorful and like exaggerated, but you know.
What inspired you for each of the quotes at each of the beginning of the chapters? Because they were quite beautiful and profound.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I think, of course, I talk about intergenerational trauma in the book, but I also try to nod to, you know, the wisdom of our ancestors. And there's a lot of work around, you know, the Black woman's struggle and Black women's place in our society, through literary icons as well as scholars. And, you know, I just wanted to honor that this is, I'm a product of their pathway. And it's a built upon work from the foundation that they've laid. And those quotes are all pointing to the same concept, the role of strength, the consequence of strength among Black women. So I thought it was, to me, it was important to honor the people that have come before.
Thank you. What would you tell your younger self now that you've written this book, you're on the other side of the book, you have admittedly gone through this journey of healing, and I think this book helped you along that journey. What would you tell your younger self?
Two things. One, speak up, and two, do it afraid.
Do it
afraid. Even though you're afraid, still do it. I was a very, very anxious young person. Like very, very anxious.
I think we all have that.
I can remember in elementary, all through probably elementary school up through my 20s. And that anxiety certainly held me back a lot. And so I would say, it's okay to be afraid and still show up or do whatever the thing is.
Yeah, I think even now I would tell myself that.
Yeah. Yes.
It's kind of like the fake it till you make it, but in a different way. Like, it's okay to feel that you can't climb something, or right, you can't do it, or you're afraid, because what happens if you actually succeed, right?
Exactly.
Sometimes we're afraid to succeed as well as afraid to fail. So being mindful of that, it's a really beautiful concept. So appreciate that. Is there a question that you've been asked on this wonderful book trail you've been doing, this book tour, that we missed, or that you really want to highlight? Because I know I'm not a perfect Oprah.
You are perfect. You are perfect, Dr. Simon.
I'm not Oprah. And has Oprah interviewed you? Because shoot. No.
Tell her to call me. Tell her to call me.
Mary J. Blige is on the back of this cover. Well, Mary J. Blige has got to know Oprah. What's up with that?
Tell Oprah to hit my line. No, I think I love this conversation. I'll just throw in a popular question is, what did my mom think? That's a popular question.
Oh, of course.
And I would not have done it without her approval. So I'll start there. And that's probably one of my best treasures of the journey, is being able to have like these intimate conversations with my mother about things that we had never before had, like her relationship with my grandmother and her dating relationships and her relationship with my dad, and in a real kind of intentional way. I also share that my mother is not the most introspective person, so she did this for the love of her child. Yep. And it took her a couple months to read it, and she read it, and she gave me her second layer of approval. So, yeah.
What would Grandma think?
Oh, no one's asked me that.
Oh, come on. I know Grandma's going, you go, girl.
Yeah.
I do. Like,
yeah,
she's
she was always just so full of pride. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it has been amazing. Thank you so much for this hour. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. You are a true rock star. And I think everybody on this call and everybody who's touched this book or met you is just appreciates you and everything that you do and what you are going to do. So I can't wait to part 2, the next book. So I hope you're starting to write again.
I'm on boundaries and rest.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. Take some time. But yes, I have so much. I'm so proud of you. I feel like a proud mama in many ways.
I received that. Thank you. Your support means a lot to me. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for for your questions and your attention. I really appreciate it.